Good afternoon. Welcome to class officially. I'm Dr. Davis, reporting live from Holyoke, Massachusetts today. Probably every day since we're all stuck at home. I hope you all are well, safe, and have minimal stress today. I'm trying to get there. One of my classes just ended, or no, three of my classes just ended. I've even lost count. Um, and I'm just trying to get on target, with you all, with closing up those classes well, and pushing this class along. Even though I only teach this class every summer, potentially every other summer, I've been teaching with Wayne State for about 10 years, maybe nine. I believe I started in 2011, in the middle of grad school, right before getting my master's. So it's been a long time coming. And, as many of you know from my introduction, if you read it, I started with Wayne State as a student employee and student organizer on the campus in about 2002. So my history with them has been almost 20 years strong. I graduated 13 years ago with Africana Studies and Journalism degrees. But enough about me. I really want to get to the content this week. And don't mind my kitchen in the background or the side of my dining room. That's just coffee and pictures. But I'm really interested in getting some of your thoughts on the content for weeks 1 and 2, which is what this week's forum is geared towards. The week 2 forum, which is due next Sunday, May 17th. Speaking of Sundays, happy belated Mother's Day, to the mothers in the class, to those who, mother, as parents, as mentors, as, a family member who stands in the role. And my thoughts are with everyone who's, missing mothers because of distance, because of loss, because of having not had that influence in their lives. Those experiences matter too during this time, especially as many of us sit and process those things. So, those things out of the way. Just to backtrack a bit, because while I delivered some web content to you about the course material, and about the assignments and the books and all that stuff, I haven't gotten a chance to talk to you about that. So, with regard to the forums themselves, this is our predominant mode of speaking to each other. So, if you're not doing the forums, you're not participating actively in class. If you're not visiting the forums beyond your initial post, that's only 70% of the grade. So the remaining 30% comes from you actively responding to at least 3 other people. If I create a post, sure, I count. It doesn't just have to be your classmates. But that engagement matters, because that is what takes place of the physical classroom, in this case of online learning. So do give attention to completing that part of your coursework, because that engagement does matter. Secondly, the syllabus. So the syllabus says a lot. The font in the later end of it pretty much is big, just because this is online only, and I didn't want to attack you with small text. So the last 5 pages of it are the ever important course schedule, which I'll hold up here. Hopefully it's not backwards as I'm seeing it on YouTube right now. But this material just gives you a breakdown of every week, in advance for the most part. But as you go, if you're visiting it, it tells you step by step what you should be giving your attention to. Reminders about assignments, content that will be delivered to you, including readings and how they'll be delivered, and tasks. Open the PowerPoint, view this video, complete the discussion board posts, midterm due, this week, blah, blah, blah. So it is important and critical, actually, that you follow the syllabus to the T, so that you don't miss anything. And if anything changes, as I noted in the syllabus itself, if anything changes with regard to the course schedule or the assignment due dates, you will be the first to know, naturally. And I won't just spring it on you. I'll give you maybe a week or two to adjust to the new reality. Unless I'm pushing something back, then I'll try to let you know a few days in advance if it's a sudden pushback that this pushback is occurring. All right, so moving on from that, the textbooks. As I've noted, I thought I struck gold with Internet Archive, which is not as useful as I thought it was. But for those of you who have extreme financial hardship or access issues, um, it could be a good tool to use if the books are available. So I believe both Takaki and Painter's books are available on Internet Archive, but it's a person by person basis. If someone completely outside of the classroom has borrowed the book, you will not be able to access it. So I really, truly encourage that you either purchase an e-copy of the books, which aren't very expensive. I know that expensiveness and costs are relative to one situation. So I try to be sympathetic, which is why I offered the links I did. But also, like, you really need these books, guys. So, like, consider an e-copy. Consider a used copy from Blackboard. Sometimes independent sellers ship a little faster than the big warehouse sellers. As I noted in my prior email or the announcement about the candy book, it took me a week to get it with express delivery with Amazon Prime. So, like, note that the shipping times take longer now, and keep that in mind as you're purchasing the books. But I'm going to show you the books in order of use so that you have some idea of what to expect. All right, so the first textbook that we'll be using beginning this week with chapters, I will say, I was going to just start listing the numbers, but the introduction, chapters 5 and 6 and 8 and 9, is the history of white people. I've had this book since it came out. I was really curious about the title and the author, who I know is a Black woman historian, or I should say is a historian of American experiences, not necessarily and solely African American experiences, but namely centered on the experiences of women, in particular during enslavement. So, like, to see that she had written this dense book about white people and whiteness and the white experience was really powerful, because most of the people who unpack white identity and whiteness in academia, whether they are sociologists, historians, or cultural theorists, are white people, and it's a necessary part of the work. And that being said, a lot of the authors that we will read who are unpacking whiteness are, in fact, white Americans, including Bobby Harrell, including George Lipsitz, including Ashley Woody Doan, my mentor. So that's something to keep in mind. Like, our reading list is full of diverse experiences. It's not just like Black authors because this is a Black studies class. It's a multitude of different perspectives, from Black woman historian Neil Irvin Painter to Japanese American historian cultural theorist Ronald Takaki. Like, everyone has something important to say about race and racism. So that was one of my goals in designing this course and the reading material. So the second book we'll use let me consult the syllabus so I don't lie to you, which is one of my favorite things to say. I hate lying to my students. So during week 5, on June 1st, we begin Ibram Kendi's Stamped from the Beginning, which has this beautiful cover here. If you've never seen this book before, this is what it looks like. I missed my hardcover version with all my notes in it, but I had a student who I was mentoring who I really adore, and she was doing a project, and I let her borrow it. So goodbye to that copy. But anyway, this is the book we'll be moving on to on June 5th. So that is my warning to order now so that you're not behind when we get there. All right. Finally, A Different Mirror by Ronald Takaki. This is a book that's been in my arsenal for about a decade. Introduced to it when I started working with a mentoring and cultural studies program at UMass with undergraduate students. And it's a powerful book, and it captures so many different experiences in America, in his gaze, in the author's gaze. And he begins this book because his son simply tells him that I can't find my history anywhere. Like when I go to school, it's white history. When I take or encounter ethnic studies courses or, like studies about non-white ethnic groups, it's, black history or this history or that history. Like, where am I as a Japanese American person? So like it's a really interesting portrait of these intersections of experience between these books, from the first encounters of Europeans and Native Americans to the literal drawing of borders around people considered Mexicans now, to like the tensions and violence faced by Middle Eastern populations after September 11th. So a lot of that is in this text, especially if you get the most recent copy from 2008. So like be mindful about what copies you're getting to. All right. That being said, I've talked about the forums a bit. Again, that is our social exchange in this class for the most part. We will not have Zoom sessions like many of you who might have taken more traditional classes this semester were scooted into. Like, this format offers a lot more flexibility of time and thought, and we're not going to try to rope everybody into meeting at one time. If people want to have a group session or a group viewing of something, we can see about that. But for the most part, that is not an expectation or requirement. You took this class in the format that you did so that you didn't have to be roped into that, because your lives demand that you're not roped into that. So assignments. There are 3 major assignments in this class, in addition to the forums themselves. That would be the midterm, which is a short book review based on short answer essays, and one of 2 texts that you would be pulling from. And I should have brought those texts out before I started shooting the video, but I'll bring them up as we get closer to the midterm. The things I think of right now. And furthermore, there is the critical film review of a film called Precious Knowledge. There is a link to it on Canopy, which is the source that you should be using with your Wayne State University library account, by the way, to watch Race, the Power of an Illusion and some of the other films assigned for the semester. Precious Knowledge is one of my favorites because, it's a story literally of these young people, these high school kids turned activists, turned community leaders trying to save their ethnic studies program from the state, from, Tea Party Republicans for the most part. Like, no diss to any Republicans, but specifically a diss to the people who tried to tell them that their culture wasn't worth learning about in schools, even though they were the predominant culture in that community. So I would like to tie our discussions and our cumulative knowledge into evaluating that film for what it is, and for what it represents in that sense. And finally, the final project which is a maybe 4 to 6 or 5 to 7 page essay on a topic of your choosing related to race and racism. So the final handout itself will list some ideas for you to choose from. The syllabus gives you some ideas itself, like especially if you look at like the course outline, the description, and some of the things we'll be covering. The topics are endless. And yesterday, in an announcement, I shared the link to my students' website. A lot of their topics deal with race and racism, or representation, or lack thereof. And, that might speak to you. One of those blog entries might compel you to form your post. So, really think about what you'd like to represent in your final project as we move closer to it. And I'll post that around week 12 or so, or earlier than that for you to complete or begin thinking about and working on. All right, so week 1 gave us a lot of things. I'm trying to push through this because I'm looking at my clock now and I'm like, oh, yeah, 15 minutes. All right, so like some things to think about. What is race? Race isn't just the color of a person's skin. Race according to the film, according to Doan's article, according to Bobby Harrell last week, it's a social construct. If you've never thought about it in that way before, hopefully this week's content gets you thinking and asking questions about how that could be. I personally have been conditioned to, you know, take some favor, humor, and pride in who I am racially. And that has been enforced because, historically, my family, other people categorized in my race, I've been taught not to take pride in that, right? So that's a part of the conditioning of growing up black in America, I think. Or you're pushed against that fact and taught to think that nothing good can come of that racial categorization, upon yourself. And so, like, what I appreciate about what our authors are doing this week is that they are talking about the infrastructure of racism, the importance of intersections, if we really look at Harrow, and the importance of realizing how categorizations can be blurred, especially in Ashley Woody Doan's article. He really attempts to unpack how some people have tried to use, individualized racism or bigotry, prejudice, to discount the very real systemic problems that disproportionately impact non-white people in the United States. Just to be clear about that, like, there are differences between the things that people call racism because their feelings got hurt and the ways that racism rears its head on a societal level, and how people who are disproportionately then impacted by that systemic violence are left to pick up the pieces or, defend that this is racist or that this reflects racism. Such is the case with the public outrage with Ahmaud Arbery of recent. Even though the situation happened in February, like the outcry on social media and by politicians and public figures across the country has required attention to this systemic violence, this, capacity for two individuals to feel like they can control, and practice as judge and juror and executioner over the fate of a man's life. Although allegedly he's just running, and jogging in a community. So, like, there are different things that you should take away from the readings from last week related to these things. And also, just to give you an example of something you could do yourself, since we're at home and we might not all have a lot of downtime, but this is just something to think about. I included a handout for the social identity wheel. This is a tattered copy, but it's the only copy I could find in my house. And it just asks you, like, identities that you think about often, that you might not think about very often, like things that make you you, what it causes for you to physically and mentally evaluate your intersections. Those areas where you experience privilege, those where you are a target of oppression. And those categories basically define one's experience in this country, as Bobby Harrell tries to point out quite effectively, I think, in her short essay, Psychosocialization. And the questions in the center of the handout really point towards where you can evaluate privilege and oppression. And I kind of break this down in some sense in the PowerPoint I shared, pointing out that identities I think about most often include my gender, because in many cases it informs how I am approached in the world when I leave my house. Like, there's race, yes, like that's an obvious one, but when I sit with my gender and think about the ways that I represent myself, the ways that I project my personality, and the ways that I protect myself in public, more than likely it's falling on gender than it is in race, especially where I live, which I'll talk about some other time when I'm not hitting 20 minutes. All right. So also, really, As far as Race, the Power of an Illusion goes, the film for week 1 and week 2, and then we return to it in week 4. Um, this film in particular is, I love it. It's a little dated, but not much has come out as holistic as this since then, especially as a 3-part series. So, Race the Power of an Illusion really focuses on first breaking down the so called science of race and showing you that it's not science at all. It's basically a lot of people trying to categorize other people to determine what their status in life should be. So, once you absorb that, the documentary moves on to the history of definitions of racism, which brings us into week 2. And with the second episode, we have the central piece of Thomas Jefferson's book, Notes on Virginia, which he wrote for Paris in describing how the new America or the United States is shaping out. And in this, like while he's talking about crops and landscapes and, centerpieces of this new society, he takes no pains outlining, the lack of civilization and capacity for assimilation of Black or African and Native American persons. So like that's what that episode is built around, and also you see some back and forth being engaged between this documentary and also Painter's book, where she's talking about some of the formative guidelines that establish race in the United States in old Europe, before the transatlantic slave trade, before the quest for global imperialism began. She outlines in chapters 5 and 6 where some of those ideas come from. And when we get to chapter 9, she's really pointing to how, even amongst, racially speaking themselves, white people were trying to still disparage other, modern day white people who they considered less than, like the Irish, trying to find boundaries and barriers according to caste, according to religion, according to economic access, where they can disparage, different groups who are now considered white. So, like, it's a complex web of histories, which lets you know it's really BS. So, if I could say anything in sum, it would be that. And I think that watching Thomas Jefferson, or hearing about how, because we don't watch him, he's not in a video, duh. But like hearing about how he attempted to categorize and define races, and how this compels different scientists and thinkers and would-be sociologists, which isn't a field around his lifetime, to begin to determine categorizations of races themselves, which we learn through Painter's study is utter garbage, like the amount of shifts and turns that this science of race takes. She, I think, or they, or this country, becomes intricately woven into this web of lies, centered on so-called race. And I think that this early portion of this class, this early third of this class, does a lot to untrain our understanding of what race is, and what racism is, was, and can be. So we're not reading all of Painter. Like, there are selected chapters that are meant to correspond with Race the Power of an Illusion and other lessons that we have along the way. But if you have time, and I'll reiterate this all the time, if you have time, please give the entire book a read. I absolutely loved it when I read through it the first time years ago. So, like, for any of these books, if you want to read ahead and read through, that's great. I'm not going to stop you. All right. And also, this unpacking of what is whiteness and who is white. This will also be touched on the third installment of Race the Power of an Illusion. But we're introduced to the concept of it here. Again, looking at the ways that other, now considered white groups like the Irish were treated by Anglo-Saxon people, by the good Christian Western imperialists initially. Like there was no parity. They weren't equal. Like the condition of the Irish and other now white groups was not the same as those of Native Americans, Africans, and eventually Mexicans and other groups to come to the United States. But it was definitely not on par with having complete, like, so-called race privilege, which is debatable now. And I think that, again, chapter or the third part of Race, the Power of an Illusion points to that, what happens along the way, as does Takaki and definitely Painter towards the end of the text. All right, but in any case, like, I included a poem by Rudyard Kipling. I'll say that so that the captions can pick it up on YouTube. Rudyard Kipling wrote in 1899 called The White Man's Burden. And this poem is it's basically his reflection on the plight of white Western imperialists to civilize and shift and claim the lands and governments and governing of world communities of color, centering his focus on the Philippine War from 1899 to 1902. This poem is an ode to those brave white men who dare try to reach the uncivilized. And it's a nod to not only the quests in the Philippines, but those in Guam, those in Puerto Rico, those across all of these indigenously inhabited islands, or islands that are inhabited by indigenous persons, as well as the people who are relics of the slave trade, and how that whiteness is noble to interfere in those pre-existing civilizations and societies. They are already functioning as societies independently of these people, but they feel some God-given compellence or reason to interfere in those spaces. And they base it upon whiteness. They base it upon Christianity. They base it upon, like them being a more superior species of human beings because of their races. So it's very interesting to tie that into the history that we're looking at. And we begin with history because to understand society and sociology, you have to know the history. That's just not a question of it. So that's kind of where we are. But getting to sociology, there's a little snarky piece that closes out week 2 by Du Bois called The Souls of White Folk. If you're familiar with W.E.B. Du Bois, you know he wrote The Souls of Black Folk, which is a very serious but beautiful study that he writes about the plight of Black Americans 2 generations after slavery, which includes himself. Or I would say maybe 1 generation after slavery, because he's in the prime of his adulthood. It's 1902, roughly, let's see, roughly, I'm doing math, don't mind me. Roughly 40 years after slavery ends, give or take. And he's reflecting on why conditions, socially speaking, have not changed for African Americans, even though they are American citizens, even though there's no more slavery, even though there are supposed to be civil rights protections for them. And he writes this whole book talking about how they aren't, and we return to Du Bois when we get to Kendi, and we read Stamp from the Beginning, because there are parts of that book that more so correlate with what he's saying in Souls of Black Folk. And Kendi spends a good deal of time talking about Du Bois as well. All right, but Souls of White Folk, he's really taken a step back, and this jumps ahead on our timeline a little bit, it's maybe a decade past, or maybe 15 years past a white man's burden, and centuries after where Painter begins. So he's really taken a look back on this imperialist quest. So this does tie into the previous information from the Kipling poem and Race of Power and Illusion and Painter's text. But he's unpacking this tension between white Europeans and white Americans, and looking from his positionality as a scholar and early sociologist of race, and saying, like, look at what we have here. Not only are y'all trying to oppress non-white folks of the world, but here we are, and you're quote unquote infighting if race is really a thing. So what is this about? And so it's his take on some of the tensions of the World War I conflicts between European states and nations, and why he thinks that this is just like a basically a model for how imperialists have encroached upon the world cultures, and tried to impose themselves on different groups, not excluding people like the Irish, not excluding Eastern Europeans, which comes to a head, especially during World War II, or vice versa. But it's very interesting what he does there, and how like this correlates with Painter's ninth chapter, where she's looking at some of those tensions between or amongst so-called white people. So, all that to say, my friends, my dear new friends, happy reading. I'll see you in the forums, and hopefully I don't have so much to catch up on next week, so the video is much shorter. Welcome to my home, and have a safe and peaceful week. And I'm going to catch up on grading, maybe take a nap, maybe cook something step by step. I'm not enjoying this, but I do enjoy teaching, so I'm glad to have you. So until next week.